The title of today's talk is Sacred but Not Serious, and I'll get to where that comes from in just a moment. I just wanted to share some ideas with you today about being able to be joyful, being able to find the joy, being able to find the bliss as we are on our spiritual path. And in the world as we know it today, with everything that's presented to us in the news and in the around the water cooler and wherever we happen to go, it's it's easy to lose sight of the joy. It's easy to get sucked into the drama of the ain't it awfuls, that are going around. And we want to recognize that that does not help us on our path. That does not move us forward into a deeper experience of the presence of the divine. In fact, that is a way of staying stuck. That is a way of staying stuck in the drama. So I was reading this week, and I like to read and I like to explore all kinds of different things. If you could see the stack of books next to my chair, it's kind of an eclectic group. There's books on motorcycle racing. There's books on learning how to ride motorcycles. There's books on the Revolutionary War, working on things, projects that were completed by the Civilian Conservation Corps in and around this area for the History Museum, just all kinds of things. So I started off several months ago. I started on a thread, or I call it a thread because I'll take an idea and I just follow it where my curiosity leads me. And I started on this thread trying to understand what was a rebellion in this country that occurred before the Revolutionary War. It occurred in the 1760s in what is now North Carolina. And it was a rebellion between the backwoods homesteading farmers and the what they perceived to be the corrupt government officials. It's called the War of Regulation, if anybody's interested to go explore that. And I started to kind of just follow that thread and start to wonder, where were these folks, these backcountry farmers who were against the corrupt government of the crown? Where were they in all of the causes for the revolution? Because the causes for the revolution that were stated in our history books, if you look at that through the eyes of a backwoods farmer, it may not mean much. What did the Navigation Acts mean to the farmers? Those kind of questions. But as I was following that thread, I came across a book that touted to be biographies of the people who shaped America, and I thought it was going to be about Madison and Jefferson, Washington, and those things, but it wasn't. It was more about the people who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was kind of fascinating to me. I hadn't really paid much attention to that part of history when I was a kid, other than that the Salem witch trials and Plymouth Rock and all those kind of things. And in one chapter of this book, it was the author was quoting an 18th century instructions to a preacher, telling a preacher how to go about preparing a sermon. And the idea was that the preacher was to first reflect upon his own sinfulness, his own shortcomings, his own failings, until he aroused within himself a deep sense of remorse. And once he had made his confession, so to speak, in his sermon, then he was to kind of bring the congregation into that and help them to arrive at a point where they too reflected upon their own sins and their own shortcomings, their own failings, and they too were kind of caught up in this deep sense of remorse. And then the whole crowd together, out of this motivating force of feeling so remorseful, out of that, then he was to lift them up and kind of give them the vision of the gladness and the goodness that would be theirs someday if they would simply obey the laws and do what they were told. Follow the commandments, obey the laws of the colony, all those sorts of things. And I read that and I said, oh wow, am I glad that I didn't live in that place at that time. Can you imagine trying to get yourself out of bed on Sunday morning to go to church and say, oh goody, we're going to go here and we're all going to wallow in remorse for a little while, and then be told what could be ours if we would only obey ourselves. And I looked at that, and we have to recognize what the reason for that is. You know, I always like to ask why 5 times. Well, you know, why would that make sense? Why would that make sense to anybody? And of course, the starting place of that theology, was the total deprivation of mankind. Mankind was just totally depraved because of the fall of Adam, because of original sin. Through original sin, everybody who is ever born was depraved. We were incapable of being good on our own unless through the grace of God, through our faith in God and through the grace of God. And unless that happened, well, then there was no hope for us. And in fact, some of the denominations believed in predestination, which was if God was going to bring you to heaven, you know, there was nothing you could do to stop it, and if God wasn't, there was nothing you could do to make it happen. Which always made me wonder, like, you know, why worry if it was already done? Why worry about that? But my point is that there's an orientation towards life that is focused on the negative. William James talked about this in 1898 when he delivered the Edinburgh Lectures on the varieties of religious experience. He said there's basically 2 orientations in life. There's what he called the happy-minded optimist, which of course he counted himself in. That's why he called him, or healthy-minded, the healthy-minded optimist. That's why he called him healthy. And just by way of a footnote, William James's parents were associated with students of Quimby, Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, who was kind of like ground zero for New Thought in the United States. But there were some students of Quimby's, and William James's parents studied with them. It might have been the Dressers, I think, that he studied with. But James said that there are 2 basic kind of orientations towards religion, and he was looking at religious experience. He wasn't necessarily looking at dogma and creed. He was just kind of looking at people, at life, and saying, what is the experience of life that these people are having? And one group he called the healthy-minded optimist, which, as I say, he identified with, and the other he called the pessimists, the negative-minded pessimists. So the first orientation and that we were talking about is that there is this group of pessimism. There is this group that starts out by reflecting on just how terrible things are, just how terrible people are, just how terrible sin is, just how terrible the world is, and they kind of get caught up in all of that. And then from that they try to break out. Well, there's another group, the healthy-minded optimists, and this is where the title of the talk comes from, you know, who kind of think, well, life really isn't all that bad at the starting place. You know, instead of believing in the total depravity of mankind, we kind of believe that God created everyone out of itself. Therefore, you know, we must be good. There's part of us that must be good. Like little T-shirt iron-ons that we had for kids in the Sunday school. It said, I must be good because God don't make no junk. I must be good because God don't make no junk. And one year at Asilomar, Reverend David Walker, who was past president of RSI, and a very funny man. He was a big man. He might have been like 6 foot 6 inches tall, probably over 300 pounds. He was a very big man. And he would come out to do a talk, and he would put his hand over his head, and he would spin around in a pirouette, and he would say that he always wanted to be a ballet dancer, and he would just get everybody laughing. Sometimes in the middle of a talk, he would just stop and laugh. And I remember one time he had us stop and had us all, there's like 1,000 people in the room, and he had us all say linoleum, the word linoleum, and everybody's wondering, what is all that all about? And he says, I just thought it was a funny word. And he used humor. He used humor very extensively in his teaching, you know. And Dr. Tom Costa was there speaking about the same time, and he was a master at using humor. He could take you into hysterical laughter, and while your hearts were open with the joy, while you were in the midst of laughing, he would sow the seed of some very, very deep truth, and it would kind of go right in. And Dr. Walker is the one who said, what we do is sacred, but that doesn't mean we have to be so serious about it. We don't have to walk around with long faces. We don't have to walk around feeling remorse for everything in life. We don't have to walk around feeling unworthy. And all of these other things that we got from our ancestry, from our traditional religions, the guilt, the depravity, the damnation, and all of those other things. But what we can do is we can learn to recognize that God is joy, God is happiness, God is bliss. Now, the human experience is not always joy and happiness and bliss. I'm not trying to say that it is. When we talk about the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, we recognize the first noble truth. What the Buddha said was all of life is suffering. It's the nature of life. It is the nature of human life. But the next noble truth says, but it doesn't have to be that way. See, it does not have to be that way. It is that way because of our erroneous thoughts, our erroneous beliefs, our erroneous emotions, our erroneous actions. And that when we cease from those things, the suffering begins to diminish. And when we remove the causes of those things, the suffering and the pain go away. So the experience that we have in human life is not always a joyful experience, but joy is always there. Joy is always a possibility. Even in the midst of times of grief, when someone passes and we're remembering them, usually there's funny stories that come out. When I was young, they still held wakes in people's homes. And we would go, I was just a little boy, and we would go to the home that the deceased lived in, and there would be the coffin in the living room. And people would just sit around in this person's house, and they would tell funny stories. Well, do you remember the time we were all doing this? And and whatever the story was, it always ended in everybody having a big laugh. Even in the midst of the grief, even in the midst of the loss, there was laughter, there was joy, there was kind of a celebration of having had an opportunity to know this person, this loved one who had moved on. So what we're saying then is that what we see, what you and I see, is largely a result of what we believe and what we expect. And if we grow up in an environment where we are a sick-minded pessimist, as James might call it, we dwell on the negative, we dwell on the pain, we dwell on the suffering, we dwell on the ain't it awfuls in the world. But if we are a healthy-minded optimist, we see the good, we see the joy, we see the laughter, we see the bliss. So we want to kind of consider this. James goes on to tell us, he says that if you go through the stages of religious experience, people have kind of this basic orientation. And then there's what he calls the conversion experience, the aha moment, the awakening. The best way that I can put it is an awakening, that we start to awaken to some type of a spiritual calling within us. And for the pessimist, that calling is in the terms of realization that, yes, life may be pain and suffering, but it doesn't have to be that way because of an intercession, because of a savior or a saint, because of something that was done external to them, that they're going to be lifted up out of this, right? So they can look, as I said at the beginning, the preacher can show them to look towards the vision of how good it's going to be someday if they just obey the law. So there's this experience, there's this conversion experience that says, well, life may be tough now, but it's not always going to be that way. See? And we can rejoice and we can be glad because someday we're all going to be lifted up out of this. And for the healthy-minded optimist, there's the aha moment that says, well, things are okay, that life is okay and life is to be trusted. And I am an integral part of that life. And there's a power in the universe that responds to me according to my belief. And as good as life may be, by learning how to recognize my spiritual nature and growing, life can be even better. And James kind of compares those two and says that's the conversion experience. And he says after the conversion experience is very interesting. He says because after the conversion experience, nothing significantly different happens. Nothing much changes. The pessimists go through life kind of believing that life is tough and it doesn't have to be tough, but other than that, not a whole lot changes, other than they feel better about themselves. They feel better about it, you know. Yeah, life is tough, but someday it's going to be better, and we're all going to go to heaven. And the optimists, they go through life saying, yeah, life is wonderful, and life can be even better. Life can be even greater. Anytime I want to get serious about about my spiritual growth, it's there, and it just stays that way. It just doesn't move much further. And what we want to look at today, what I kind of want to look at today is how can we understand why we tend to stay stuck, even though we know, as what James would call the optimist, even though we know that life is good and life can get better and that we can grow and we can get closer to the divine presence and we can experience more love and we can experience more bliss. As the Dalai Lama says, we can just learn to be happier, you know, learn to be happier. Follow your heart, follow your joy. Do what brings happiness, and it'll lead you closer to your spiritual experience. Why do we tend to sometimes find ourselves stuck in the negative? Why do we tend to find ourselves stuck in the drama? And I want to give you this picture, and I'd like you to kind of keep this picture as we go through the rest of the talk today. But I want you to keep this picture for the week. It's something that happened last night. We were watching the news, Lori and I. And you know, the news's job is to kind of scare us. Everything is totally serious. Oh my goodness, it's so serious. You know? And they even talk funny, you know, today, and they try to make it really sound like dreadful. You imagine a newscaster if you went out to supper with them and they'd say, "I have the potatoes, please." You know, they would be just really stern. And the report was about stingrays on the beach in San Diego, and there was a lady anchor was standing there, and the camera operator had a very nice medium shot. You know, you could see this person about from the waist up holding the microphone in front of her face, and in the background were people on the beach and the waves kind of crashing. It was a very nice shot, camera shot, and she's sternly going on about the dangers of the beach and how people need to be careful and all these kind of things. And in the background, there's this little girl. She must have been like 7 or 8 years old, and she got on the beach and she had her arms out and she was flying. You know how kids do? They put their arms out like pretending like they're an airplane, and she was running back and forth, and she was banking and she was turning and she was tilting and she was just zigzagging her way from from wherever she came. She was just zigzagging her way down into the ocean. She was going to go play, and here's this news anchor just trying to you know scare the willies out of us about how careful we need to be, how serious this is, you know, how cautious we need to be. You know. And here's this little girl, woo, she's just having fun. She's just having a blast. She's totally oblivious to whatever danger the news anchor was trying to convey. So I want you to get that picture. I want you to get that picture in your mind. Because there's always going to be people who are serious. There's always going to be people who are telling us what to worry about. There's always going to be people who are so worried about the depravity of mankind that they think that they need to mind your business for you out of a sense of duty to themselves and to the community. They need to protect everybody by watching their neighbors and what they're doing and turning them in so that they could be punished, you know, because in that colony, if the colony tolerated sinful behavior, God might punish the whole colony. So that gave them justification to go and spy on their neighbors and worry more about the splinter in their neighbor's eye than the plank in their own. And while all of that's going on, there's still the healthy-minded optimist. There's still the little child who loves to play, who loves to just enjoy the breeze, who loves to go and dance. And that's really where we want to be. And here's kind of the reasons why. And here's I think some of the reasons why we're stuck, And the first one is fear. The first one is absolutely fear. We have been raised in a culture that tells us we need to fear God. I mean, that's how people interpret what's written in the Bible. Now, not everybody interprets it that way, but a big portion of our population tells us that we need to be afraid. That we need to be afraid because this is serious stuff. Because if we don't get it right, what are the consequences? If we don't get this right, this pass or fail test that we have here on earth, if we don't get it right, well, we're going to be suffering forever and forever and forever, And they paint a very vivid picture of tortured souls, burned flesh, and all of these other things to scare the dickens out of people. And there's part of us, no matter how hard we try, there's part of us that is influenced by that. This fear. Fear it permeates our society. It's everywhere. There's got to be something to be afraid of. No matter what you want to do, there's somebody who's going to tell you why you shouldn't do it because you need to be afraid of it. You can't trust people. You shouldn't be doing that. You have to be afraid. And there's this mistaken belief. And I actually read a book, I'll just toss this out, called Virus of the Mind, that talks about, in the olden times, somebody who could be aware of what was dangerous and could warn the society or the ruler, whoever was in charge, to warn them of the dangers that might lie ahead. That person could be very valuable in society. So the person who would say, now, we can't drink that water over there, that water's no good, but we can drink this water over here, that was an important person to the survival of the community. So it kind of evolved over time that being a good warrior, knowing what to be afraid of, was important, it was respected, it was valuable, and people tend to carry that on long after it has any usefulness, We don't have to worry too much anymore about the things that we had to worry about when we were living in a very rural environment and we were living off the land. We don't have to worry about whether the red berries are poisonous or not. Somebody else has already taken care of that. So there's a part of us, and there's a part of us, our society, that wants to be afraid. And as I've been talking over the last couple of weeks, there's a part of society who would want everyone to be afraid because it is a means of keeping them under control. There was a movie, I think I've told you about it, there was a movie that was made in 1952, and it was called The Jayhawkers. And it starred Fess Parker, which everybody, all of the kids in that era we knew was Davy Crockett, and Jeff Chandler were the two stars of the movie. And the movie opens up, and it takes place on the Missouri-Kansas border prior to the Civil War. There was border disputes going on. You remember there was a big controversy over slave states versus non-slave states, and I think they came up with what was called the Missouri Compromise. But there was violence. It had broken out into violence, and the movie opens up, excuse me, and these bad men are riding into town, and they're shooting up the town, and they're burning things down, and they're doing a lot of damage. And you know that they're bad guys because their face is covered with the typical cowboy bandana mask, and they're wearing red leggings over their pants. And they were called the Missouri Redlegs, and they were the bad guys. So they go in and they shoot up the town. And then the next day, Jeff Chandler comes riding in with his group of merry men, and they're the good guys. And Chandler says, I'm sorry, it looks like I'm a day late. I've been chasing this band, the Missouri Redlegs, all across the Kansas territory. And I aim to get them and bring them to justice so they're good people like yourselves. You don't have to tolerate these kind of raids. And I'm going to go get them, but there's a couple things I need from you. First thing I need is money. Second thing I need is supplies for my men. And the third thing I need is for you to swear your loyalty to me, because once I put an end to this this hostility, we're going to withdraw Kansas from the Union and make it a sovereign country, and I'm going to be the emperor. So he gets these people to do all that. They go and they get whatever money they have, they get their money and they give him part of their money. They go and they get their food and they give him and his men part of the food, very food that they have to eat. And they swear their allegiance to him that when Kansas becomes a sovereign nation, that he's going to be the emperor. And then they ride out of town. And of course, as the movie goes along, what you find out is, well, there's really only one group of men. One night they ride into town wearing the bandanas over their face and the red leggings, and they shoot up the place, and then the next day they ride in as the good guys, promising to save everybody if they will just give away all of their freedoms, if they will give away all of their material goods and swear their allegiance to Jeff Chandler. And I'm sure that in the 50s that the director was kind of taking direct poke at McCarthyism and kind of the paranoia that was going on. It might have been 59 the movie was made instead of 52. But the point is the same, that people use fear as a means of getting other people to acquiesce, getting other people to stop thinking for themselves. And if you look at some of the traditional religions, people were discouraged from thinking for themselves. They didn't think, they just did what they were told. Just act, just obey the rules. It is so because the people in authority have said that it is so, and you don't need to worry yourself by thinking about it, by studying it, by questioning it. Oh my God, even to question, well, that was heresy, you see. If you try to question something, you were put out of the community. There was one essay that I was reading about a lady who started to come to what we might call the inner light, or the Quakers might call the inner light. We might call it a mystical experience. But she started to experience the presence of the divine, and she started to recognize that it was this presence within her that was most important, not the rules and regulations that were being handed down to her by the Massachusetts Bay Company. And she was tried for heresy, and she was put out of the colony. They couldn't tolerate the fact that there was somebody else, somebody other than those who had received their rightful authority from the king by a piece of paper that put them in charge. They could not accept the fact that there was somebody else who claimed to be able to know truth, particularly when the truth that she knew did not agree with the truth as they were teaching it. And you just have to think about this for a moment, because traditional Christianity, the way it comes to us, is largely through the writings of the Apostle Paul. If he didn't write it, his thought influenced it. The majority of books that have come to us in the New Testament reflect the ideas of Paul. And yet Paul's claim to authority was that he had a mystical experience of the risen Christ. It wasn't through books, it wasn't through organizational hierarchy. He never personally met Jesus, but the way that the story is told in the Bible, on the road to Damascus, which is a story, a teaching story. On the road to Damascus, he was knocked off his horse and he was blinded by the light. So here we have an entire way of thinking about religion that is based on the mystical experience of Paul, or certainly influenced by the mystical experience of Paul, and yet over time that theology had evolved to a point where it would deny that same ability to have the mystical experience to other people, and if they claimed it, they were considered heretics. So one of the reasons that one of the things that we have to do is we have to overcome fear. We have to, if we are experiencing fear, we have to break out of it. I went up to the mountains this week with our oldest grandson. He's learning how to drive, and I took him up to drive in the mountains a little bit, give him some experience with gravity. And I was telling him this as we were going through the curves. You have to keep your eyesight where you want to go. You have to focus on the center of the road where you want to go, because there's this phenomenon that is known as target fixation. Now, they talk about it if you learn how to ride a motorcycle. They also talk about it if you're flying an airplane. It happened to fighter pilots, but it can happen to anybody. And target fixation just means that you give your total attention to that you don't want to happen. You give your total attention to that which you are afraid of. So you're heading down the road and you go into a curve and you're going into the curve a little bit faster than you ought to be going, a little bit faster than you're comfortable with. And all of a sudden you realize that there's a guardrail over there, maybe 12 inches away from your car. And instead of looking where you want to go and doing the things that you need to do to slow the car down, put your foot on the brake and turn the wheel a little bit more and all of that, what we do is we look at that guardrail. We give our entire attention to that guardrail. And what happens is when you're moving, wherever you look, that's where you go. If you're riding a motorcycle, you go into the guardrail. You're driving a car, you go into the guardrail. If you're flying an airplane, and this used to happen to the fighter pilots, they would get so fixated on the plane that they were chasing that they would fly right into it. They would crash into it. So when we are afraid, what happens is we get what's called tunnel vision. Our field of vision narrows. We don't see the big picture. We don't see everything that's going on around us. We don't see that entire curve that's on the road. We don't see all of the possibilities of things that we could do, but instead we focus on the very thing that we don't want. And it comes to pass, right? It comes to pass. That which you think and believe in your heart, you shall experience. So what we want to do is, if we find ourselves getting kind of sucked into the drama, sucked into the fear, sucked into the atmosphere around us, think of that little girl. Think of that little girl with her arms spread out like an airplane, running in circles along the beach, enjoying the breeze and learning how to fly. And what we need to do is we need to bring ourselves back and say, wait a second. Wait a second. What does God have to be afraid of? God has nothing to be afraid of. What enemies does God have? God has no enemies. What does God lack? God doesn't lack anything. And then we want to bring to mind kind of the words of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord shepherds me. I lack nothing. I lack nothing. So we want to try to break ourselves out of this idea of fear, which is so prevalent in our society. We want to recognize that the ideas that people had, the theology that people had that told them to be afraid, it was appropriate for them at that time, but it's not appropriate for us in this time. Another thing that I think that holds us back from kind of experiencing the joy, experiencing the bliss, opening ourselves up. See, when we are experiencing the joy and experiencing the bliss, we are open and we can see the bigger picture. We're not locked into tunnel vision. Okay? So Dr. Tom Costa would get us laughing and get our hearts open. And while our heart was wide open, then he could show us something different. He could show us a new way. He could talk to us in a different way, and we would get it. Our heart would be open. We would receive it. So I think another thing that we have to consider is that one of the reasons why we stay kind of stuck in the drama that society is stuck in is this idea that we're not worthy. Who are we to be happy? Who are we to say that life is good when obviously it's not, when obviously people in the world are experiencing so much that is not good? And what we have to recognize, what we have to do to step back from that, is to recognize that the experiences that we are having in this world, the experiences of pain and suffering that we're having in this world, are not necessary. They are, as we've talked for the last several weeks, they are reflections of human consciousness. They are reflections of the way people believe it ought to be. So that lady standing in front of the beach with the microphone talking in a very stern and very serious voice, well, that's the way people who do the news think it ought to be done. And that's the way the producers want it done. If she didn't do it that way, they would hire somebody who did. That's the way that the people who watch the news ratings and sell advertising, that's the way that they want it done, because it gets ratings. It generates advertising revenue. So my point is that the world is the way it is because that's the way the balance of power and the balance of thinking wants it done. And just because it is that way, just because human beings create pain and suffering for themselves and for others, does not mean that the opportunity for joy and the opportunity for bliss and the opportunity for happiness does not exist, and does not mean that we should not feel entitled to it, that we should not feel that it is appropriate for us. New Testament theology tells us if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the ditch. Somebody has to be able to see clearly. What good does it do the whole world if we all stay stuck in the drama of what's wrong? If we all stay stuck in the pity party, if we all stay stuck in pointing out to one another what is wrong with this world. So somebody's got to break out of that mess. Somebody has to break loose of it. And this is where we turn to joy. I'm not talking about a self-centered, give me more stuff kind of joy. I'm talking about true joy. I'm talking about the joy that comes from the experience of the presence of the divine. So we recognize that the divine has no enemies. The divine has nothing to worry about. And the divine has no lack. So when God creates, God doesn't create because it needs anything. You and I go to work because we need money to pay the rent. We need money to put gas in a car. We need money to buy groceries. So everything in the human experience is based on a sense of need. We do things because of need. And you have to ask, well, if there was no need, what would we do? What would we do? And that theology that is caught up in the fear says, well, we would be lazy, so we need to have a need so that we can work really hard, right? And another thing our society does is we make it hard. If it's going to be valuable, it needs to be hard. So we have to make spiritual practice in the traditional religions. We have to make it hard. There's got to be tough rules to obey. You got to struggle hard. Somebody once figured out, and I don't know who they were or how much time they had. Obviously, it was before the new Pokemon game. And they looked through the Bible and figured out that there's 611 different things that people need to either do or not do. And in any day, in any given day, there's 611 different things that we need to either do or not do in order to live a virtuous life and get to heaven. And of course, 611 things. Most of us on the way to work, we can't remember if we turned the coffee pot off or not. How are we going to remember 611 different things that we need to do or not do? It's an impossible task. Excuse me while I take another drink. It's an impossible task, but it does demonstrate that it must be very valuable because it's so hard. And in our society, we do that. We have created a society that worships hard, worships busyness. When people work really hard, that's good. If they get a lot done or not, doesn't matter. As long as they're working hard, you got to work hard. You got to work hard. Excuse me. We even got that into our society. We call it the work ethic. You got to work hard. It's virtuous to work hard. And when those people got on their boats and sailed halfway around the world and met cultures where you didn't have to work hard because everything was easy, there was plenty of food to eat, the climate was very, very gentle and all those things. Well, they called those people lazy. Those people were lazy and they needed to be put to work. So they put them to work kind of digging gold to send back, or growing sugar plants to send back, those kind of things. So it is ingrained in the culture. It is ingrained in the Western mind that it's to be valuable. It needs to be hard. So we try to make our spiritual growth hard because it's important. It's valuable. And it makes sense in that twisted logic. Anything that's valuable needs to be hard. Spiritual growth is very valuable. Therefore, we need to find a way to make it very hard. And what I'm saying is if you look back at what God is, keep in mind we can never know what God is, right? It's the ineffable, the unknowable. But if we try to think about it and contemplate it, we recognize that there's nothing hard for God. There's nothing difficult for God. It was no more effort to create an ant than an elephant, right? The divine speaks its word and it is. It has no enemies. It has no lack. It doesn't create out of a sense of need. And when we can identify with that as being kind of the natural state of our soul, then we can start to realize that if God doesn't have enemies, and if God doesn't have anything to be afraid of, and if God doesn't need anything, then why does God do anything? Why does God do anything? Does it need to? Then why does it? And we come back to this idea of joy, that the divine does what it does out of joy. And Dr. Holmes tells us that joy is the excitement that we experience when we expect gladness and goodness. When we expect gladness and goodness. That's joy. Right? Are we expecting gladness? Are we expecting goodness in our life? Or are we sitting around worrying about all the things that could go wrong and listening to all the people who are telling us why we shouldn't do it? Or are we identifying with that which has never been afraid, which has never failed, which only completes everything that it starts, which only acts out of joy? It is sacred, but it is not serious. It is sacred in that what we are encouraging everyone to do is to go within and to make the contact with the presence of the divine that is pure joy that is within us. That's the sacred part. To recognize that it has created us out of itself, and therefore the essence of what we are is sacred as well. Again, not in an egotistical because of who I am way, but in the spiritual essence of what I am. And the serious part is all of the worry and all of the negativity and all of the drama and all of the struggle and all of the ideas that we've got to do or not do 611 different things every day in order to avoid making God mad. See, God has never been mad. There's nothing you or I could possibly do that could make God mad or could make God happy. Right? The divine is totally unaffected by us. So that's a great relief and a great freeing idea that we don't have to worry about God sitting up in heaven with a book writing down everything that we've done, because it didn't create us for that purpose. It created us for joy. It created us to enjoy its own life and its own experience in us, as us, and through us. So now we start to turn away from the fear. We reject it. We absolutely turn away from it. Say there's no need for it. It's so overdone. It's so overblown. Right? It's been used to manipulate. It's been used to intimidate. It has been used to take that which God has made and called good. It has been used to call that evil. And we have no need for that. We have no need for the manipulation. We have no need for the control. We have no need for people to tell us that we are doomed to burn forever unless we do what they tell us to do and give them our money and give them our loyalty. So what we want to do then is we want to come to this idea of what the Dalai Lama had said. You know, when I told you the American psychiatrist went and says to the Dalai Lama, he says, you know, you Tibetan Buddhists, you've been studying human psychology for thousands and thousands of years. He said, you must be like the experts in the world. He says, can you tell me why do people do what they do? And the Dalai Lama laughed. Now here's an example. The Dalai Lama laughed. Here's a man who was kicked out of his own country, who saw his countrymen slaughtered, who has lived in exile for all these years. And every time you see him, he's smiling, he's laughing, he's chuckling. He has found joy. He has found joy within, not in the circumstances. There's no denying the circumstances. But he's not caught up in those, you see. He's caught up in the joy. And what the Dalai Lama told this American was, well, I guess, he says, I guess if I had to say why I think people do what it is that they do, I would say that they're doing what they think is going to make them happy. Emma Curtis Hopkins would say that we are seeking our good, right? We move because we are seeking our good. We stay put because we are seeking our good. I think that they both may have been saying the same thing. And the Dalai Lama said that over time we learn what truly makes us happy. And the way to our spiritual growth is simply to do more of what makes us happy and to stop doing the things that make us unhappy. No 611 rules, no 10 commandments, no putting people in the stockade for doing the things that they weren't supposed to do, no kicking them out of the colony, no sending them off to live someplace else because they wouldn't obey. No labeling them as a heretic because they heard the voice of God within. None of that. Very simple. Be still and know. Be happy. Be happy. So we come to recognize then that we are worthy of this idea of being happy. Right? That to choose to be miserable doesn't lift anybody else out of the darkness. It doesn't help us, it doesn't help them. We don't ignore their plight. We don't ignore the fact that they're suffering. We do what we can, but we do the most important thing that we can, which is to lift human consciousness out of the darkness with the only place we have to work, which is ours. So we start to recognize that by us growing spiritually, by us using joy as our compass, by us finding out what makes us happy, and again, you have to figure out what true happiness is as opposed to pleasure, but find out what makes us happy. What is it that brings joy? What is it that is the gladness of expecting the good things to happen, expecting the best, and following that bliss? Joseph Campbell would say, follow your bliss. What is it that makes you feel blissful? Rumi, if you read Rumi's writings, he talked about his friends, and he talked about God, and he talked about his relationship to God in ecstatic terms, losing oneself in the other, the dervishers dancing and whirling and completely losing themselves in the movement and experiencing the presence of the divine. Even in modern times, we had the shaking Quakers called the Shakers, and they believed that when you felt the presence of God, you couldn't help but dance, And of course, dancing was frowned upon because it would look too much like people might be having fun. It was frowned upon. We shouldn't do that. We need to be serious about these things. These people said, no, I feel the presence of God. I want to sing. I want to dance. The Shakers' idea was that everything that you did with excellence. You did it to the best of your ability, and the next time you did it even better, because everything you did was an expression of God. And that's why their furniture lasts, for hundreds of years. It was so well made because what they were doing was expressing God. So we start to recognize then that joy is our compass, that we need to get out of the rut that society is in. We need to break away from the fear. We need to recognize that we are more than worthy of experiencing happiness, that we have been created for that very thing. That when we look for the happiness, that we open up our vision. We get out of the target fixation. We stop focusing on what it is that we don't want to have happen, and we see the bigger picture of all of the goodness that is there, because right in the midst of this world today, the presence and the love of God is visible. We have to get our head out of our fear and our thoughts of unworthiness, and we have to take it in, and we have to look at it. So as we go through the week, as we go through life, let's look at all of the things to be glad about. Let's look at all the things to be happy about. Let's look at all the things to celebrate. Okay? Get that picture of that little girl on the beach running with her arms spread, being the airplane, banking and turning and running in circles. I couldn't hear her, but I imagine there was a yippee or two coming out of her little mouth. While there in the foreground was the stern reporter in her stern voice telling us all of the reasons why we shouldn't go in the water. And the little one would have none of it. We are told in the New Testament to be like the children. And I don't think that means to be childish. I think that means to be free, to be innocent, to trust in the one who sent us, to be curious about this thing called life and to wonder how things work. And to be open to question, to be open to explore, to be open to discover, to be open to be happy. So let's go through this week together then, and let's recognize that everything is sacred. Everything is the presence of God. Everything is the love of God if we will but look for it. And let us recognize that our spiritual growth does not require us to put on a long face and to dress in bland clothes and to look scornful and sorrowful and to be sad and to be serious. That was the old way of thinking. It is time for us to let that go, to roll it up at the things of the past, to throw the scroll on the fire, and to just recognize that God's love is all there is, and all it asks of us is to be happy, to be joyful, to look for it where it is and stop looking for it where it is not, to look for it where it is in our hearts, in the joy that we feel, in the smile of a child, in the embrace of a loved one, in the joy that our pets show us when we come home from work, in all of the little things that tell us that life is worth living. That's where we're going to find God. So let's be about our sacred work, but let's not be too serious about the whole thing. So it is.